So, good evening and welcome. My name is Igor Kowal, or in Ukrainian it's Ihor Kowal, and I prefer the Ihor, particularly now at this point in time.
Microphone, is that turned on? Yes.
Is the mic on?
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, I'm part of the Concord for Ukraine volunteer activist group that we have in Concord. You've probably seen our signs on a lot of the roads leading into Concord. That group was formed just a few days, actually 3 days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we held a rally on Monument Square. About 200 people showed up at that, and that kicked off the Concord for Ukraine activity. The primary aim of Concord for Ukraine is supporting a fabulous local organization called Ukraine Forward. They're based in Boston. They are entirely volunteer-based. It's an organization that has 501c3 status. There's about 35 people involved. They volunteer their time and effort in procuring medical supplies, tactical medical supplies, for the territorial defense groups in Ukraine. Also, they have sent in reconnaissance drones and walkie-talkies, because that is what the territorial defense units do actually need. They're also working with a number of hospitals near the front line in central and eastern Ukraine. So far, they've shipped about $500,000 worth of supplies to Ukraine, of that $500,000, 20,000, more than 20,000 has been raised through Concord for Ukraine. However, there's been a couple of private individuals that have raised money as well, and one of them is in the room today. That's Julie Davidson and her husband Charles. They put a concert on 3 weeks ago at their house, and they raised $27,000, all of which went to Ukraine Forward. Another person who has the shop, it's called Revolutionary Concord, that's Mary Foley, has raised, just on her own initiative, has raised $1,500, and that money will be given to Ukraine Forward very soon. So at the entrance here on this little table, there's a flyer on Concord Ukraine. There's a couple of QR codes on there. One is to donate money. The other one is to procure through Amazon medical supplies, tactical medical supplies. So if you please take one of those if you're interested in donating. There's also another sheet there which explains what Concord for Ukraine is, what it does, and what our aims are in the future. There's also one more list there. If you're interested in helping us in any way possible, then please sign up, your name and the email, and we'll get in touch with you. Another way to get in touch with Concord for Ukraine is concordforukraine@gmail.com. It's all no spaces, concordforukraine@gmail.com. You've seen the signs all over Concord, so do that, just put gmail.com. We look forward to having more people involved in our efforts to support Ukraine, and that way we also support the great volunteer group that they have in Boston. It's local, called Ukraine Forward. I'd like to thank the library for arranging this event, and in particular, the president of the library, Sherry Litvak. Is she here? Oh, okay. Hello, Sherry. So thank you very much. The director of the library, Elaine Smith, who's new to the library, and also in particular, I'd like to thank the main reference librarian, Barbara Gugliese. And so thank you very, very much. And I'd like to thank Mark Pawley from Minuteman Media, who's here, who will be recording this event, and it will be made available to the general public soon. So let me now introduce, maybe I've taken too much time, but let me introduce to you Dr. Emily Chanel Justice. She is the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. She is a socio-cultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. She has pursued research on political activism and social movements amongst students and feminists during the 2013-2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. She received a PhD from the Graduate Center of City University of New York in September 2016, and she was a Havighurst Fellow and Visiting Assistant Professor of International Studies at Miami University of Ohio, 2016-2019. She is currently teaching at the Harvard University Summer School, teaching the Ukraine on contemporary Ukraine. And Emily recently returned from Poland, where she was helping with Ukrainian refugees. As you know, most of the refugees are women and children. So please welcome Dr. Emily Chanel Justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much to everybody for being here. Can everyone in the back hear me okay? Great. A little closer? Okay, I'll use my teaching voice. So thanks everybody for coming. Thank you so much for the support for Ukraine. It's really meaningful to come just to drive through Concord and see so many blue and yellow flags. It's really heartening for someone who's based my entire career off of people's generosity in Ukraine. It feels like paying them back for that. So thank you, and thank you so much for your interest. So the war began, as you remember, on February 24th, 2022. We are in the 4th month of this war. According to some official estimates by the United Nations, 4,731 civilians have been killed thus far in the war, and that includes hundreds of children, and we can guess that the true number is much higher. There are 8 million refugees, most of whom crossed Ukraine's western border to European neighbors, and there are 7 million people who are estimated to have been displaced, forced to leave their homes within Ukraine. As of a few days ago, the Ukrainian Armed Forces claims that over 35,000 Russian troops have been killed in the past 4 months. This could be an exaggeration, but the United States expertise has also recognized that Russia has lost at least 25% of its combat power that it originally used in the invasion. And even the Russian government is starting to admit that its troops are dying in Ukraine, although it's not admitting any true numbers, and we're not really sure how that information is circulating within Russia. So the really big question is, how did we get here? Russia, of course, led by Vladimir Putin, claims that Ukraine is not a country. This is partly because Ukraine, the territory that we know of as contemporary Ukraine that you see on this map, has been part of Russian empires going back for centuries. So that includes the Russian Empire that began in the 17th century, and that includes the Soviet Union, which we should all also be considering as an empire. Both of those, those empires claimed Ukrainian territory as part of a fundamental part of those imperial powers, even though Ukrainians in the territory of what we know as contemporary Ukraine claimed that Ukraine was a unique country, it was its own place, there was such a thing as Ukrainian identity, and this goes back for thousands and thousands of years. But Ukraine was known as the Second Soviet Republic. It was the most important Soviet republic within the Soviet Union, partly because of its agricultural contributions, partly because of its industrial contributions. There were lots of universities. There still are lots of universities in Ukraine that were central to the education of the Soviet population. So Ukraine has always been seen as central, and that's why Vladimir Putin today, and many Russians agree with him, unfortunately, that Ukraine should inherently be part of Russia because of its proximity. Obviously, it's got a very large border with Russia. But Ukrainians have been claiming independence for much longer than that. One of the first times, I'm glossing over many thousands of years of history here, just to focus on a couple of elements in the 20th century. One of those is in 1917. So while the Russian Revolution is happening, there are many different political movements in Ukraine that are also claiming an independent Ukrainian state. They were trying to build governing institutions based on those political movements. They succeeded in claiming the Ukrainian People's Republic, which existed from 1917 to 1922. A lot of that same territory that makes up contemporary Ukraine was part of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Unfortunately, in 1922, the Bolsheviks started to gain power in the eastern part of Ukraine that you can see on the right-hand side of the map. And so the Soviet takeover of Ukraine happened gradually from 1922, and that included destroying those nationalist movements that claimed the Ukrainian People's Republic, but it also included intentional efforts to stomp out the Ukrainian language, to crush Ukrainian artistic production, writing, and that included, at least partly through intentional famine. Joseph Stalin created a famine policy in 1932, 1933. This is known as the Holodomor. It caused massive famine around Ukraine, but it also allowed, when Ukrainians started moving west or they died, lots of Russians and Russian speakers started to move into eastern Ukraine. And so these sort of helped to create these Soviet claims that Ukraine was part of Russia or should be part of Russia, and that Russians and Ukrainians are the same, even though Ukrainians were fighting against that all of that time. So eastern Ukraine, up to around Kiev, kind of midpoint of the country, is incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1922. The western part of the country takes much longer to be incorporated into the Soviet Union. The far western territories officially get taken over in 1945, although independence movements and anti-Soviet movements, guerrilla fighting continues throughout the 1950s. But Ukraine has been fighting against that superpower claim to its territory for many years. And these historical narratives of fighting back against the Soviet power and fighting the imperial power before that, those are important aspects of Ukrainian national identity up until today. So in 1991, we have Ukraine's definitive break with the Soviet Union, and certainly this is when the rest of the Soviet republics become independent as well. So Ukraine declares independence, representatives declare independence August 24th, and then the country holds a national referendum on December 1st of 1991. So this map reflects the voting percentages that supported the independence referendum in 1991. And I think this map is really informative because a lot of what we talk about when we talk about contemporary Ukraine is regional division, that the East is inherently different from the West, and there's nothing that can be done to reconcile those two parts of the country. As you can see on this map, every single region, including Crimea in the south and the city of Sevastopol, all voted in favor of independence in 1991. Obviously, you can see that some of the percentages in Western Ukraine are substantially higher, but it's 83% in the two territories that Putin claims are experiencing anti-Russia sentiment and that should really be part of Russia. Those territories voted 83% to become independent, to become part of independent Ukraine. And like I said, even in Crimea, 54% is still a majority. And so I think this really tells us that in 1991, the sentiment was that Ukraine should in fact be an independent country, and that people agreed largely that it should be. So Ukraine has not actually had a census since 2001, but the estimate of Ukraine's population is around 44 million, and it is the largest country entirely geographically in Europe, so it's slightly smaller than the state of Texas, just to kind of give you a sense of how huge it is. So what has Ukraine been doing since 1991? I think one of the big questions in this war is why now? What about this particular moment made Vladimir Putin decide that now is the time to try to take over Ukraine? And I think that the thing that's really different from 1991 is that Ukraine has really showed over the past 30 years that it wants to be a democracy. People in Ukraine want Ukraine to be a democracy. They're willing to fight for that democracy over and over again. And really, in 2022, I felt very strongly that Ukraine was really moving in the right direction. And I think that's really something definitive that makes Ukraine different. So you can see in my favorite graphic that Ukraine has had, of course, 5 different presidents since 2000. There was a different president in 1991, by the way. He's not on our graphic. But it starts in 2000, which is, of course, when Vladimir Putin, who's on the middle line, comes to power. Putin is, for a moment, not in power from 2008 to 2012, when Dmitry Medvedev becomes president. Putin at that time is serving as prime minister, basically still holding all the power, and he has come back into power now. Officially speaking, he is allowed to remain president until 2036. We can assume that he's going to find another way to stay in power unless, something else happens. But at the moment, academically, there has been a lot of attempts in the past 10 years or so, to talk about Russia as a hybrid democracy, to sort of say, okay, Russia has these elections, there's some, authoritarian tendencies. I think that was a huge mistake, because I think it allowed us to make excuses to see that Putin was popular and, there was some semblance of democracy, and that's not true. And that consolidation of power around Vladimir Putin is kind of what has allowed this to happen. And I've kept Belarus's president, Lukashenko, also not legitimately elected. He's on the bottom. He hasn't even had anybody fake take over his power, although he's, like I said, not legitimately elected. And many Western countries, including the US, recognize Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as the legitimate democratically elected president of Belarus. But it's important to note these two are sort of, Belarus is at this point, Russia's biggest ally. And then, of course, just to point out Voladimerzalenski, current president of Ukraine, who you've all seen probably rather a lot lately. So he was elected in 2019. And one of the interesting things about Zelensky is that he was really facing kind of a lot of criticism and had pretty low approval ratings at the end of 2021. He was working on a lot of rather unpopular domestic reforms. And that, I think, kind of made the time maybe seem like it was good for Putin to invade Ukraine and try to take over, that maybe Ukrainians wouldn't back up Zelensky because he wasn't that popular. And he's proven them all wrong. And I think that's really showing us something good about Ukrainian democracy. So the other kind of definitive moment for Ukraine is 2013 and 2014. So as Ihor mentioned, I did my research in Ukraine in these years. My research happened to take place during the Euromaidan protests. So this was this moment in 2013 when the president at that time, Viktor Yanukovych, was supposed to sign an association agreement or an economic agreement with the European Union. At the last minute, he decided he wouldn't sign it. He would turn Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence, sign an economic agreement with Russia. And people were really unhappy about this. So they came out into the streets, first a couple of thousand at a time. Then they started to occupy the main square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti in Kyiv, Independence Square. They first started by occupying this square, trying to sleep over. This group that was mostly made up of young people and students were attacked by the riot police. They were beaten, they were arrested, and that broke everything. And people came out in the hundreds of thousands. They would not accept this regime that wouldn't allow people to protest, wouldn't allow people to make their voices heard. And so those protests began in November of 2013. They continued on through February of 2014, when there was a violent uprising. 100 protesters were killed during that time. The president, Yanukovych, ended up being removed by those protesters. A new government was elected and put into place. And really since then, since 2014, I think that Ukraine has been working rather well toward a better democracy. It's imperfect, of course it is. Every democracy is imperfect. We live in an imperfect democracy. But it's really the process and the fact that so many people were so invested, not just from this moment, but continuing on after 2014, they really wanted to see Ukraine be in a better place. And I really think that that is what Vladimir Putin is most afraid of, is having this democracy right next door, where not only a democracy that people want to live in, but where when somebody no longer represents them, they know that they have the power to come into the streets and make sure that they hold the people that they elected accountable. And that's something that's really remarkable about Ukraine, but as I said, very, very threatening to Russia. So, of course, the Russian response to these protests was the first invasion of Ukraine. And that started in March of 2014 with the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula, which you can see on the bottom part of the map. So this was a territory that was historically given to Ukraine during the Soviet period. As you saw in the 1991 map, its residents wanted to be part of an independent Ukraine. Certainly contested territory. It also has its own indigenous population that was deported by Stalin in 1944. Stalin claimed that this indigenous population was collaborating with the Nazis during World War II, so he deported them and killed a lot of them. So it's always been a very politically contentious area. And in March of 2014, largely as a response to these pro-democracy protests, Russian forces came into the territory, took it over, held a referendum to ask the people who lived there if they wanted to be part of Russia. That referendum is not really regarded by most experts as legitimate. It was done under coercion. A lot of people were prevented from voting. And really, unfortunately, the Western response was not very good. And I think that that set a bad precedent for what's happening now, because there was really not a lot of pushback, not a lot of sanctions, despite the fact that Ukraine's sovereignty had been violated in this moment. And then as the months went on, these separatist movements, so pro-Russian activists, pro-Russian groups, and some Russian forces themselves in the two eastern territories that you can see on the map, Donetsk and Luhansk, started to also ask for something similar. They wanted to be annexed by Russia, they wanted to be part of Russia, and so they took over some of the main government institutions in those regions. The Ukrainian armed forces at this time in 2014 was not very strong, it was not very well organized, and it really wasn't well funded, it was kind of a mess. And so that's when the first war begins, and the Ukrainian forces were able to fight, but not that well. They really didn't have the power to push back and reclaim these territories that are in red. Russian forces were responding in these territories. It took Putin, 2 years or something to admit that there were actually Russian troops in this war, but they were absolutely there. And basically, over the past 8 years, this has been an ongoing war. A lot of people kind of think of it as not necessarily a Cold War, but kind of in a static situation. There was a front line. It was moving always, and soldiers were always dying, but not in very large numbers. So it was really kind of easy to forget that there was a war in Europe for the past 8 years. And so, even in Ukraine, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine since this war started, and you can go to a lot of places where you really wouldn't even know that there's a war happening at all, despite the fact that, like I said, soldiers are still dying. So Ukraine was sort of able to just go about its business, and this war happened, preventing to some extent Ukraine's entrance into institutions like the European Union, potentially in NATO, which I'll talk about next. But I also want to point out, moving to this topic of NATO, Ukraine was not a member of NATO in 2014 when this invasion happened. Ukraine was a neutral country. And so when Vladimir Putin starts to claim in early 2022 that NATO expansion is threatening to Russia's security interests, and therefore, intervention in Ukraine has to happen, that's not really an excuse that makes any sense, because Putin already invaded Ukraine when Ukraine wasn't part of NATO, when Ukraine wasn't even thinking about being part of NATO. And even I hosted a conference in February, a couple of weeks before the invasion, and experts on Ukraine, from Ukraine, agreed largely that Ukraine had at least 10 years before it would even be able to really seriously apply for NATO membership. So it's also not true that Ukraine was really that close to NATO membership at all. Obviously, things have changed now. But I also want to point out something that I have thought was really interesting, is that Ukrainians weren't that interested in joining NATO themselves. So as I mentioned, the 2014 protests, they were really originally organized around the European Union and Ukraine's European future. So the EU was always a bigger priority for most people, and NATO seemed like this organization, first of all, too many requirements that Ukraine was not going to meet, especially given the state of its military. But secondly, partly because a lot of people in Ukraine understood that NATO was seen as this counterbalance to the former Soviet powers, it wasn't really that interesting because it would be too provocative to try to join NATO. However, as you can see in the graph that's on the right, Ukrainians have gradually been more approving of the idea of joining NATO. So this is research that some of my colleagues have been doing, where they basically have been doing this nationally representative survey every year since 2014 from every region in Ukraine. And in 2019, that's when you start to see every region of Ukraine, there's a majority of people who support the idea of joining NATO, and that's a dramatic shift. So some of that, I think, has to do with the election of Zelensky, who talked about NATO more than previous presidents. But some of it also has to do with a growing Russian threat and this idea that, there's only so much that we can do as Ukraine without having some kind of protective security agreement, which Ukraine, of course, unfortunately, did have in 1994. They negotiated that Ukraine was the power, the post-Soviet power that had the bulk of the nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. And so they agreed to give up their nuclear power in exchange for security guarantees that Russia would recognize Ukraine's sovereignty. This was supposed to be, it was signed by Russia, the US, the UK. This is called the Budapest Memorandum. So Ukraine gave up all of its nuclear power, nuclear weapons stock, in order to have its security guaranteed. Obviously, that did not happen. Even when they were invaded in 2014, that was not something that was mobilized. So we end up really returning to NATO because there aren't any other options. And so I have a map. I just think it's, I thought I would just point out, not only is there certainly NATO expansion eastward here, but we have to start to color in Finland and Sweden, because now we need a new color that isn't an aspirational color. And I just think it's, for somebody who made up the excuse that NATO expansion was a threat and used that as an excuse to invade another country, by doing that, Putin made NATO a greater threat to Russia. And I think kind of rejuvenated NATO. I mean, it was just a few years ago, the US was talking about decreasing its contributions to NATO. This isn't a security institution that we need anymore. And now NATO is perhaps the most important security institution in the world. So obviously, Ukraine is still not a member. Ukraine is not really on the path to membership. The main thing that Ukraine wants is Article 5, which is when a NATO member is attacked by somebody else, other NATO countries are obligated to attack. NATO is not going to extend Article 5 to Ukraine right now, obviously. That would start a World War III. However, NATO is doing what they seem to think that they can to support Ukraine, and NATO allies also are too. So I think the dynamic is sort of still shifting and worth paying attention to. So what's the current situation in terms of the war? So I've given a fair number of presentations about Ukraine over the past 4 months, and this map has changed dramatically since the first one that I gave. And I know it's pretty detailed, but this is a Twitter account that does these updated maps every single day, so they have the best data. You will probably recall that on February 24th, forces were coming down from the north, trying to overtake Kyiv. There have been airstrikes all over the country. There continue to be airstrikes all over the country. But the Ukrainian military has responded admirably in so many ways. Certainly they have, pushed back and protected all the cities, especially Kyiv, but they have liberated all the cities all the way to the north to the Russian border. They're in control of the large swath of territory pretty far to the east. And so the fighting is now concentrated in those red regions. So the purple territories, if you can't see, are the previously occupied territories that were occupied in 2014. And then the red regions are the ones that have been occupied since the 24th or have been attempted to be taken by the Russian forces since then. So the current fighting is really concentrated. If you can see in the kind of center right red part, there's a little jut out of yellow. This is sort of where a lot of the fiercest fighting is happening. It's a bit of a strange situation because it's really kind of hard to say what the end goal is from where we are now, partly because the fighting is so severe still. So Russia has obviously succeeded at taking over rather a large territorial corridor in the south. So that's from Mariupol, which previously you heard a lot about in the news. The photos from the first part of the slide were from Dmytro Kozatsky, who is one of the Azovstal defenders, who is a photographer who volunteered, and he ended up there, and he recently shared his photo, his mom shared his photos with my institute, and we put them online. There was a prisoner exchange today. 95 of those Azovstal defenders supposedly have been exchanged for Russian prisoners of war. I don't have confirmation about all of them, if they're alive, what state, but that's the news that I read today, so that's really a positive development. So obviously, these cities, Melitopol and Kherson, are currently occupied places. There's a huge uprising of Ukrainians who, don't want to live under Russian occupation right now. I was recently in an event with the mayors of those two cities. The mayor of Melitopol, I believe, had been kidnapped and tortured and released. And they're at the forefront of fighting these occupations. So, even though Russia has a strong claim right now to those territories, it's not really the end of the story. I can say that for sure. And then obviously, the Ukrainian forces are fighting rather strongly in the east. I mentioned that the military in the past 8 years it was in shambles in 2014 and 2015 and has really dramatically shifted in the past few years, largely because of US-Canadian investment in technology and education and trainings. The US wasn't giving Ukraine a lot of lethal military aid up until the past few years, but what they were doing was training Ukrainian military units on how to use updated technology. And so a lot of what we actually don't know is information about the Ukrainian military, where it is, what it's doing, but that's a really good thing. That means that they're actually in kind of control of their narrative. And obviously what they're doing is working. It's not all sunshine, they're running out of forces, they're running out of troops, they're running out of equipment. So it is still really important to keep advocating for military aid, but it's a lot better than I think a lot of people thought it would be. So obviously also we're dealing with a major humanitarian crisis as well. I mentioned the refugee situation. I talk a lot about big numbers. The numbers are really not very fixed. It's a lot of estimations. So the UN currently estimates that 8 million people have been displaced outside of Ukraine. So they're currently refugees. Now, I want to point out that 8 million means that's the number of people who have crossed the Ukrainian border since February 24th. We don't know how many of those people actually stayed in the place that they are. That's a lot more difficult to count. That also counts people who have crossed multiple times, right? So we're not really sure that number. And in addition, today I read see if I wrote it down somewhere, 2.8 million people have actually returned, have crossed back, have been counted to have crossed back across the border. So again, we don't know if that means that 2.8 million people are no longer refugees, or that means, people crossed and then crossed again, right? We don't have a lot of sense of this. But according to the UN data I read today, 3.5 million Ukrainians have asked for temporary protection in a third country. So that means that they have officially registered somehow as refugees. So whether that's in Poland or Germany, the UK, the US, that means that they have accepted that they have this refugee status for a certain time period. Obviously, Poland has been the recipient of the vast majority of these refugees. Today's number is 4.146 million people. Again, that's very close, it's right next to Ukraine. So there's a lot of fluidity on that border. I already know people who I met when I was in Poland, they've already gone back. And most people I spoke to really wanted to go home. So a lot of people in situations of displacement, people have a tendency to stay as close to home as they can, partly because they don't see themselves as long-term displaced. They don't want to, admit to themselves that they might have to stay. And so if they stay closer, it's a lot easier to get home from there. You can see the numbers they're all under 1 million in the other neighboring European Union countries, pretty high in Hungary these days. That's a new development. The UN numbers are claiming around 1.3 million people in Russia. I'm not really sure about this number. Russia has certainly forcibly deported a lot of Ukrainians, and I don't know if that number includes them. I don't know. Russia is probably not telling the truth about how many people it's claiming to have deported. Certainly, we have to recognize that there were some Ukrainians when the war started who had pro-Russian sympathies who immediately went to Russia. That's certainly true, but I highly doubt that it's that high of a number. So, like I said, these numbers are really fluid, and that's part of what makes the humanitarian situation so difficult to assess, is because we don't really know how many people are in each place, how long they'll be there, and what their needs are. And then the other major situation with regards to the humanitarian question is this number of internally displaced. So Ukraine already had 1.5 million internally displaced people from the previously occupied territories. That was the number up until February 24th. So now the UN is estimating somewhere around 7 million people. But again, this is a really hard number to assess. Many people have left. There is an official status in Ukraine of internally displaced person, but not everybody registers for it for a number of reasons. One of the other questions here is how many people are internally displaced, they have moved, and how many people are homeless. We are also trying to assess right now the levels of damage to things like housing and infrastructure. And it's not just housing, but it's also things like roads have been destroyed and railroads are being destroyed, food sources are being destroyed, educational facilities, hospitals. So, maybe you can go back and live in your home, but do you have access to any services that would make it possible to actually live there? And I will say that there are a lot of people, first, there's already a lot of people, like I said, who are going home, whether or not it's safe for them, they are going anyway. And so there are organizations that are thinking about how to rebuild, because there's no point in waiting to think about this. I mean, obviously, it's not a good idea to put a lot of money into rebuilding until the war is actually over and the occupation, is finished. But people are already going to go home, and so how can we rebuild Ukraine in a way that really helps people actually live safely and protect their homes and all of those things that they're concerned about? So the Kiev School of Economics is one group of researchers that's doing really great research, not only on the destruction itself, but how much is it going to cost and who are they going to ask for that money? So I really recommend, if you are interested in those numbers, you can look at their research. Like I mentioned, I was in Poland for a couple of weeks doing some volunteering, and there's some really interesting initiatives going on there. So I worked a little with the World Central Kitchen, which has been prolific in Poland and in Ukraine, which is just truly amazing to me. They have a control of a lot of supply chains in Ukraine too. So when you saw yesterday a shopping mall got bombed in Crimean, World Central Kitchen was on the ground with hot food, delivering it to people who were there. So they contract out to a lot of local people, which is a really helpful way, to get services to people. So the train station in central Warsaw is a place where there's a lot of information. There's a lot of Ukrainians who are helping there, a lot of international volunteers. And there's all kinds of services, and this is great. It's really amazing to see so many people willing to help one another. I have started to hear that the Polish government is going to cut back on some of the funding that it has been doing. So when the war started, they basically made it possible and easy for Ukrainians to cross the border into Poland. You didn't need an international passport. You didn't need COVID vaccination or negative testing. You didn't need a pet passport. And so they made it really easy, relatively, for people to cross the border. And then they created a special status for refugees in Poland. So you could register with this identification number, get your refugee status, and you would get cash payment as a refugee. You could get payment if you were a kid or if you had a kid. You could also, if you lived with a Polish person, that person would get money to help support you because they were your host. Some of those programs are starting to end. That's going to change people's calculation and how they make decisions. Some people rely on those cash payments. Some people rely on these types of services. The other place that I volunteered was this free shop in Warsaw that was just donation-based. They just got people to donate groceries that they would then give away, as well as clothing, mostly secondhand stuff, but some also like really high-end Polish fashion houses would donate these fancy dresses, and it was very interesting. But this shop just closed just this week. So these services, that's part of both the ingenuity of the system, but the drawback of the system. It's almost entirely volunteer-based, which means that people like you are motivated to help out because you can see that there's a need, but it's also not sustainable in a lot of ways because people have jobs, they have kids, they have lives. The city had given this group, it was a cinematography NGO that got the building, and they lost the lease, they couldn't afford to pay, and the volunteers were exhausted. They were working every single day of every single week for almost 4 months. So it's a fluid situation, and I think in terms of thinking about refugees and displacement, that's one of the most important things, is to just think about constantly shifting needs. A lot of people are going to be not home for longer than they thought and longer than they wanted, and so their needs are changing all the time. they may have to leave Poland if these resources, aren't available to them. I do think a lot of people will go home if they can. One of the women that I met with, though, was from Kharkiv, and she has no return. She has nowhere to go home to. So what's she going to do? These are all the calculations that people are making all the time. So just to think a little forward, I wanted to share a couple of things of how to help as citizens from here. Obviously, in terms of donations, Ukraine Forward has already come up, doing great work. I'm recommending World Central Kitchen as well. I was really impressed with the work that they were doing, really low overhead. And like I said, they contract out to local chefs and local communities, local kitchens, which is great. And if you would like to send some money to the Ukrainian Armed Forces, you can send that through Come Back Alive, which is a great organization. And certainly, contacting representatives, just making sure that this is something that people are still talking about and thinking about. I know there's so much going on, obviously domestically, that we're all concerned about too, but this is, I think it should still be something that our representatives know that constituents care about. And then I say this, I feel a little like, I don't know, I don't think that the internet is activism necessarily. However, sharing good information is an actual active part of this war. And that's Ukrainian friends of mine have told me over and over again that making sure that people know what's going on, that they have good information, that's part of the war that they're fighting. I mean, that's what Ukrainians are giving everything up for. So I really recommend the Kyiv Independent. This is a totally crowd-funded, Ukraine-based English language news source. Their journalists are really fantastic, and they do a lot of different coverage. And you're always welcome to check out the Ukrainian Research Institute's website. We have a lot of different resources. We share as many of our affiliates when they publish as we can. So if you're not sure where to look, those are some good resources. And then share that with people you know. When people ask you what's going on in Ukraine, point them to those sources, because people are really doing a lot of great work to make sure that the information is out there. And so you can also contribute to that. So I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks everyone for being here, and все буде Україна.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'm concerned about Odessa.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all are. And I'm concerned about the influence in the Black Sea, obviously, in terms of being able to get ships in and out and everything else. Do you have any information on what kind of progress is going forward there? And
Yeah. So for those of you who need a geographical reference point, Odessa is in between the purple, the red, and the yellow. That is a precarious position to be in. I've been holding my breath about Odessa because I thought there would be more of a concerted attack earlier, and there hasn't been, and I don't know why. So I think there's a couple of factors. First of all, grain blockade is very successful already. So Russia controls most of the agricultural exports from Ukraine already, thus provoking a global food crisis, which they are now acting like it's sanctions that are causing the global food crisis, but just it's not, it's them. So, I mean, to some extent, they already have the control that they need, I guess I would say, or at least enough control to put the pressure that they want to put on. I think there's a kind of imaginary, if you'll indulge me for a second, Odessa is such an important city to Ukraine now, but kind of in the Soviet imaginary as well, as this cosmopolitan city with its own humor and its own language, its own literature. It's a really unique place. And I am not sure, I think it's possible that Putin knows that he could not recover from not taking Odessa if he tried. So Kyiv is the capital, right? Like Ukrainians wouldn't let the Russian forces take Kyiv. It's the seat of government. They don't want a coup. Okay, fine. But you can't get that close to Odessa and then fail to take it without, I think, a huge sense of loss because of the claims and the kind of meaningfulness of Odessa. I don't know if that's just my own, fabrication and hopefulness. But I mean, I wouldn't assume. And also, I mean, the other thing is that, what we saw in all of these cities in the south, which are largely Russian speaking and have a lot of Russian population, didn't want the Russian forces to come in also. So it's also true that Odessa is going to fight back if there's any fight. So I think the calculation has also a realization that these cities are not going to fall as easily as would need to happen at this point without totally destroying them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, go ahead. And then.
You've spoken quite eloquently about the past that you've shared and the present, and I wonder if you could venture at all into the future.
Well, Ukraine is going to win the war. That's the only option. How long it takes is an open question, and what it will look like, I think, is in terms of how long it will take and what the institutions and interventions will have to be for Ukraine to win. I think the other question is, what will Russia look like afterward? Because it can't keep going as it is, in my opinion. And the potential, if Putin leaves power, I don't know what's going to happen then. Could be, it depends on how that happens too, right? There are lots of different options. I'm not optimistic that there's, some shining person who's going to come in and turn Russia into a democracy. That's unlikely and foolish to, no reason to get caught in that trap. However, there are enough different forces and different powers and people who are armed and have all these different interests that if Putin is somehow removed from power, the implosion in Russia could be really serious. But as long as we've invested in Ukraine's future, then Ukraine could be even more secure after that. So, there's a lot. There's really a lot of unknowns. I will say, I mentioned, every Ukrainian I met in Poland already wanted to go home. People want to rebuild. The idea of Ukraine is strong, and people really believe in it. So that's something that I think we can move forward with, even if we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. There's a lot to go on, which is optimistic. Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, please.
So much of what you hear on this side of the world is Putin's doing this, Putin's doing that. To what extent do you have any feel or data in terms of what Russians feel about this whole situation?
Yeah, this is a difficult question because we don't have a ton of data, because it's really impossible to get good research and good survey data right now. I have seen some pretty not great images recently of kind of Russian enthusiasm on social media for the bomb that dropped in the shopping mall yesterday, things like that. There's a lot of pro-Putinist sentiment in Russia. So for me, the problem is this. At least a lot of people who had any means to leave Russia, who were critical of the Putin regime, but unwilling to really fight against it, they left after February 24th. So you have a lot of criticism by Russians, but they're not in Russia. And so what you end up with in Russia is still very pro-Putin, pro-war. Every single friend of mine in Ukraine has family members in Russia who doesn't even believe that there's a war happening that they've told me about. So that sentiment exists and is really prominent. There is an anti-war movement in Russia. It's small, and it's, how effective is it is a great question. But I've been hearing about really interesting things like, I mentioned people in Ukraine being forcibly deported into Russia. Some of them are getting into Europe. Russian activists are helping them get out of Russia. So there are things that people are doing. Is it enough to, there's not going to be, I think, a wave of public anti-war protest. I think people are going to do these little things that they can do to try to stay under the radar, to try to not get arrested. And that's how they're going to fight, the ones who are going to fight. But really, unfortunately, the public sentiment seems to be very pro-war, which is, unfortunate, but not unexpected either. Yeah. So in the back, and then go over there.
My name is Voladimerzalenski. I'm from Ukraine. Now I'm American citizen. I would like to say to everybody, thank you for support Ukrainian, people and government. And can I spend your time with?
Sure.
I live in Concord, first my year in USA. My daughter graduated Concord Online School. Now she lives in California. Last 2 months she volunteered in Ukraine. She lives in Ukraine now and help volunteers. Help. Here's a couple of my athletes. I'm coach. I have business in start business contract, and now I have business account. And I very appreciate my athletes and my friends who help so much Ukrainian. I hear your speech, and thank you so much for help. I would like a little bit, if it's possible, I sure 90% people, maybe American encountered, I'm a little nervous because I would like, every morning I talk with soldier, Ukrainian, because I help special soldier who really were here, were Donbass and Lugansk, this hard. Every morning I talk. Today, 2 a.m. I talk with 3 group soldiers. And I would like to say what soldiers tell me, explain American people. Everything what we talk about, now different war now, different now situations. First 3 months when Russia would like occupation Kiev, Putin tell 2-3 days he will be in Kiev. And now it's first time was like, war was like World War II. A lot of Russian tanks moved to Kiev and Cherkasy, Sumy, Kharkov. This territory start, and here too. Now soldiers who start work here, and now everybody in East Ukraine till now different war. What happened now? Russia used advantage art 10 times artillery Russia stronger than Ukraine. What they do? They use art like territory, peace and peace. Like step and step. Ukrainian soldier can answer because Ukraine don't have art. And you told about memorandum 1994. Ukraine was third country in nuclear, and Ukraine would like show all world. We would like the peace. We would like be neutral country. And was memorandum where USA, nuclear country, promised Ukrainian. If something happens in your territory, we'll support you, save you. That's why Ukrainians ask now God, help us. Only 2 countries really help. This is USA and British. Other country, a lot of talking, but Putin lobby, press, political, and Germany promise, forgot, and try something to do it. I'm a little nervous because I talk with people who every day die, friends die, and told me today 5 people, my group, 3 people today, my friend cry. And so today, not my friend, it's my uncle, but now he work here, and his group 2 attack Russian, 2 kill. I would like to say thank you, my athlete and my friend Pamela, who helped send later Biden, many times, and Biden answered, administration Biden answered for here. Send later for government and Congress, and answer too. If you remember, start help Ukrainian was first $380 million. It was start work. It was nothing. Now much different. But if you talk about 1991, what happened with Crimean and Donetsk, if sanction was start here, when Obama was president, it will be much different, maybe never war. Yep. Sanction in 8 years. Now, again, a little bit late. Everything helped late, 6 months, 2 months. What now? Next month or 2 months, will be decide this will be country or no. Why? Because now the European political, a lot of European political would like press Ukrainian be peace with Russia right now. What Putin would like? Putin would like make this territory and talking with President Ukraine about peace right now. If Ukraine will go now talking in peace right now, it will be, this territory will be a long time again like this first time. Long time will be same for Russia. And after 5-6 years, and he again move forward. Because what? Look, this is Russian. Now Belarus war with Ukrainian too. Because Russia used territory Belarus to attack Ukrainian city. Here only Poland, this is territory, it's not Russian. Moldova here, Prednistrovia, this Russian army stay. You must understand, Ukraine just all territory, close to all territory, Russia. What now different? Different now, Russian use air, military air, don't move territory Ukraine, attack Ukraine here, and come back.
Long-range missiles.
And same here, Crimea, attack Ukrainian territory, and don't move on the territory of Ukraine. Why? Because administration USA and NATO decide we can attack Russian territory because it's scary. What next? Now, what Ukraine can now, people ask, what you must do? If you can attack Russian territory, we never will improve. What now? We have, I would like really help what we can do. Concord, I ask the people who understand what my terrible native speech English, because it's my second language. My friend, she write later to President Biden. If people would like help, we would like signature and send later and ask about support with special art for Ukrainian. Last 5 days ago, Ukraine used first time HIMARS. Only Ukraine asked about 200, now she has 4. Imagination, this territory Ukraine where she must keep army, only 4 HIMARS for all territory. This is like, it's nothing. That's why I would like to ask, if Ukraine have good spatial equipment, Ukraine will won. Will won. If Ukraine won, its civilization will be different. Ukraine can work. If only soldiers give us weapon, we will win.
Yeah.
I would like if Pam read this later, if you are ready, finish this later, if it's possible.
I think, excuse me, may I just interrupt Ponomarenko? I know about you. You should join Concord for Ukraine. We all have the same goal, to support Ukraine and get Russia out. And I agree with you. It's like Ukraine is fighting with one hand.
Yes.
Because we can't send. If a couple of bombs fell on Moscow, it'd be different. But people here say it'll be nuclear war. I don't think so. But I understand. And let's meet. I know you're an actor. Let's meet. Let's sit down and talk how to do these things. I agree 100% with.
But people forgot about 1940 when everybody would like say, okay, Hitler take East Czech Republic and after peace Poland and finish where? Finish World War II where million people died. Now don't stop Putin. Putin will move. He will start after. He will start Poland. Start Lithuania, Latvia. This is NATO. This is will be NATO.
Yeah. I agree, and I think most of the people here will agree. Let's give some other people, because the library actually closes at 8 o'clock. Maybe we have a couple of, say, 10 more minutes to get out. So a couple of more questions, please, to our speaker.
Yeah, in the back there.
Now, how would you shape Ukrainian victory as a total withdrawal of all Russian troops forever?
Yep.
And no acceptance of them staying in the eastern part?
Correct.
And that is the current feeling in Ukraine?
Yes. As of today, I read something, I can't remember if it was 85 or 95% of Ukrainians said they would not accept any territorial concessions. And President Zelensky has said that he would give a referendum before accepting any type of peace agreement, probably partly because he knows that Ukrainians will not accept those concessions, and it gives him a little bit of bargaining power rather than be forced. I mean, we have heard some, you're not wrong, these European leaders who are saying, let's give Putin an off-ramp, let's, find a way. I think you're right. He will sit there for 5 years and then he will do it again and again and again, and it might be worse. And so there's no, Russia is a bad faith actor. They are not a good negotiating partner. So you cannot, I just don't think there's any reason to negotiate with them. And Ukrainians don't think so either. I know a guy he's from Crimea. He's displaced in 2014. He's in territorial defense, and the first thing he posted when the war started was, "Great, now we can take back Donbass and Crimea." So that's the sentiment: is that not only are we going to win, but we're getting this territory back. So I think that's the only thing. That's the only option. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
A while back, and I'm sorry I don't have full details, but a while back I saw on a show, I think it may have been Democracy Now!, there was a reporter or analyst who was Ukrainian, and he said, and I don't know if it's the same group, he was alluding to a military group that starts with an A, and I don't know if it's the same.
Azov.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and what this person was saying was that they are, if I have the same group in mind, that they actually were the equivalent of what we would call a right-wing militia, and that they're actually not supported by the majority of the Ukrainian people. Because at one point they were being lauded as heroes and all that, but then he was saying it was the only place, I ever heard it, where he said they're not the heroes that you think, and the people don't support them. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so the Azov battalion that you're thinking of is they're an interesting organization. So they started in 2014 during the Euromaidan protests. A lot of different organizations kind of consolidated and cropped up at that point. At that time, they were a far-right group. They started out as a kind of volunteer militia. So they started out fighting during the protests. They created a kind of volunteer military battalion that was fighting in Donbass. They were friendly to the far right. They did have some kind of neo-fascist ideologies as part of their background. They did use Nazi symbology. I have been very critical of this group in the past. However, over the past few years, so they also, one of the things, so going back to the kind of Putin's explanations, one of the things that he was saying was that Ukraine needs to be denazified. So he was making these claims that there's all these Nazis in Ukraine. And one of the reasons was because the Azov battalion created this civilian wing that had created a political party and had some connections with the president. So there were far-right groups in Ukraine from 2015 to 2019 that had some political power. Not definitive political power. I don't want to overblow it, but I don't want to pretend like they didn't exist either. So certainly that does not justify, there's no such thing as denazification. That's made up. I've read a lot of interesting reports about the Azov battalion in the past couple of months, and there has been reporting since around 2018. So from 2015 on, there were really substantial reforms in the military. And one of those reforms was to take these volunteer battalions that were fighting in the east and integrate them into the Ukrainian military. And that includes the Azov battalion. So they actually were sort of pulled back from that ideological positioning of their fighting in order to get integrated into the Ukrainian military at the same time that their power as a kind of right-wing group starts to fall. And so their leaders, most of whom are completely different than the ones who founded the organization in 2014, distanced themselves intentionally from that far-right ideology, decided to treat themselves as a military battalion. They were based in Mariupol. They trained a lot of people. There was this whole idea of kind of readiness, like they were technically officially part of the territorial defense, but they would, welcome volunteers and that sort of thing. And they had kind of established this new position for them. I know somebody who was in this organization in the past few years. So they really did try to distance themselves from that kind of far right positioning. Their civilian kind of political party had absolutely no success. They have no power in government whatsoever. And I would say they were definitely, if not, I would say, like, lauded in Mariupol. They were kind of considered an important part of that city's, positioning and kind of contribution. And I will say, those are the people who stayed in Mariupol until the very end. Many of them died. Many of them gave their lives to save Ukraine. Russia destroyed that entire city. That city does not exist anymore. It's gone. And these are the people who, stuck around to make sure that every single civilian person could get evacuated from there. That's pretty heroic to me. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Ukraine has a very vibrant political culture. Do we know anything about how people are supporting Zelensky and of course the government? Because you know, everybody's like Poroshenko and all the others are playing very nice with each other. But is that reality? Is everybody unified and supporting Zelensky as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You know, you hear some criticisms here and there because you just, of course, that's what's going to happen. I mean, Zelensky, I think the thing that's most remarkable about this is that Zelensky has taken the things that he's best at, which is being on TV, advocating. By the way, he has a degree in law, like he's actually very well educated and was reasonably prepared to take on a lot of this stuff. But he's really taken this figurehead position and I think done a fantastic job. Part of why he's able to do that is because every single person in Ukraine is volunteering with their best skill set, right? So I think part of why it works is because he's doing the thing that only he can do. So if he were trying to do more than that, or trying to control too much within Ukraine, like these volunteer networks that are all helping distribute whatever is needed, then there might be more criticisms. But because he has, he's got the request for military aid, he is not backing down from asking for military aid. He is saying, you have to give us weapons before you give us, humanitarian aid, because as long as there are airstrikes, people are going to die. That's the end of the story. He's really, I think, pushing this kind of, referendum orientation. So really, really making sure that Ukrainians feel like he's not going to give something up with everything they're defending. I am absolutely sure that the moment this war is over, political infighting is going to be not pretty. But I think that he's represented Ukraine well by staying also. I mean, just the whole choice to not leave really made, I think, a lot of other people really feel like they could invest. And I don't know, I mean, I think he's really doing what he is best at in this circumstance. Like I said, his approval rating was in the 30s, I think, in November of 2021. It wasn't that high. But that was partly because he was shopping around solutions for autonomy of the occupied territory. I mean, he was doing really bold stuff. So yeah, just it's been an interesting evolution for sure. I'm curious to see what happens. There has been some pushback almost entirely outside of Ukraine. He's banned some pro-Russian political parties, for instance. He's banned, some pro-Russian TV stations. I don't personally have a problem with that. I understand that it maybe doesn't feel that democratic, but these are people who are influenced by Vladimir Putin, right? They're his mouthpieces in the Ukrainian government. They don't need to be there. So yeah, we'll see. Yeah, I think was there one more question in the back? Yeah.
I just wanted to add that Oslo did have like a really checkered past. It had some parts that were stellar, but at the same time, in the last 5-ish or so years, they also had, members that were ethnic Russians, Jews, some were actually served in IDF in Israel. So I feel like they've kind of started out poorly, but at the same time they've done the work to sort of like themselves.
Yeah.
Plus they've included
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, you can boost up our money so.
Yep. Do we have time for one more
I was
question?
going to say one thing. I know Alex spoke for a long time. I have a letter here. I would love people to sign it. If you want to write your own letter, that's great. It's to the White House. It's asking for 100 more of the long-range missile systems instead of the 4 that the country has. And what I think I want to express, since we live in a democracy, is that I have been calling, and I have been calling the Capitol and writing. I have gotten responses, and while I know I'm just one voice, I think taking advantage of this opportunity has resulted collectively in some real contribution, military contribution. If the country doesn't have the right military weaponry, which is getting more sophisticated, that's being used against them, then all the humanitarian aid is for naught. So I don't like to lead with military, but I think this is a critical point that Alex is making, and I just want people to understand. So I have a letter if you'd like to sign it, if you'd like to take a copy or have me send them, I'd be happy to share what I'm sending. But I appreciate people's activism, so thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. I completely concur. And unfortunately, and they're very critical of the government. They're very critical of military expansion and power, and they're also asking for weapon systems. If those people, if your average sociologist wants weapons, let's get some weapons. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much.
This is the Ukrainian flower.
Thank you so much. Thank you.